Okay, guys, I wanted to just kind of weigh in briefly on the recent Joe Rogan show that featured Chris Kresser and Dr. Joel Kahn in the, kind of in a debate. It was kind of, uh, it was about 4 hours long, if relatively limited in scope, in my view. I think they could have gone on for 10 hours quite easily. There's enough material to cover there. But I want to say that I think Joe Rogan did a great service by having these folks on. I think both men conducted themselves in a very professional manner. I think both of them, had their opinions. I think the, who quote unquote won or not is not really relevant. I think people that have a certain ideological belief are going to continue to support whoever they support. If you're a diehard vegan, you're gonna agree with Dr. Kahn. If you are a meat eater, carnivore, you're gonna agree with Chris Kresser. And I'm not here to say who won or who lost. I think there were I think it's nice to see that there are a scientific and logical argument to be made around this topic, and it's free of emotion, which a lot of stuff that goes on there. In fact, we're going to have Dr. Kahn on my podcast, and we'll go more into some of this stuff. Hopefully we won't have to cover too much of the same ground. But what I'd like to point out, and I think is very important from Chris's standpoint, the argument that he makes are some of the similar arguments that I make in my book. I think they're very valiant, and I agree with this. And one of the things he talks about is the problem surrounding epidemiology, and particularly nutritional epidemiology, and that much of it, in fact, the vast majority of it, and the vast majority, as Dr. Kahn points out, nutritional epidemiology is where we get our data regarding nutrition. And the problem is most of it results in very weak associations. And I think Chris did a very nice job of pointing out the fact that those weak associations are, at best, can be used to drive an hypothesis that later needs to be tested. But most of what we depend upon is basically just saying we're gonna support this weak epidemiology and try to make policy decisions or dietary decisions based upon this. The little anecdote he gave about the horoscope study in certain disease conditions. I think he pointed out that if you're a Sagittarius, you have a 38% increased risk of having a broken arm. Well, obviously we know that's complete garbage. But at the same time, that 38% risk is a higher risk factor than what the World Health Organization pointed out about red meat and cancer and colon cancer. They only pointed out a 17% risk for red meat and an 18% risk for processed meat. So we have to say, how really significantly relevant are these weak associations derived on epidemiology? It doesn't matter which way the epidemiology go, whether it supports meat eating or it doesn't. Again, it's very weak data. Okay, and so the other important point he brings out, and I point this out as well, is when we look at associational data, we have to ask, who are we talking about? Are we including the correct people in that associational data? That is to say, he said, well, there's no real data on meat eaters that are health conscious paleo eaters or keto eaters, or in my case, carnivorous eaters. There's no data that we can put in that epidemiology that says, these people have been separated out and we've controlled for these guys and show what their outcome was. It just hasn't been done yet, at least to the scale that some of these other tests are going. And so we have large groups of, McDonald's carnivores, that eat the French fries and the Cokes lumped in, and then we compare those to other diets, and of course those guys are going to do awful, and people kind of conflate that to the meat eating, which again I think Chris does a reasonably good job of pointing out that healthy user bias is a very significant confounder here, and I agree with that. The second point that he makes, and I think this is a very important point, and I also have talked about this in the past, is mechanistic data is nice to have. It's interesting, but it has to be translatable into what happens in actual human beings, in real life, under rigorous scrutiny. And so what he's saying is, you may have a mechanistic data that shows that, eating or being exposed to TMAO, or heterocyclic amines generated in cooking meats causes mutations in cancer cells in a petri dish. That's a mechanism, or it may even cause subtle changes in an animal. Those are mechanistic data. But again, if we look at the human data, those things don't hold up yet. And so we have to say, okay, it's a mechanism, but what other things are going on? Are there other things that happen in the body that mitigate that? Are there other, Rhonda Patrick is always pointing out these mechanistic things with like sulforaphane. It's been shown to decrease, this or that thing in labs or even in animals or sometimes even in humans, but we don't have the big picture. And so we have to look at the big picture and see that, if I add sulforaphane to cell culture and it causes less cancer cells to grow, that's interesting. The question becomes, what about when we add it to cell culture and it causes damage to the DNA, which other studies support, or causes elevation in liver function studies, which it also shows. So again, we have to show, are there good, robust studies in human beings that say giving everybody a bunch of sulforaphane results in significant benefits to human beings? I don't think those studies are there yet. There's some early suggestions that it might be, but we don't have that in large quantity to make those decisions. And so mechanistic data is interesting. Epidemiology drives hypothesis, but again, we can't make our decisions based on that. You know what else drives hypothesis? Are case reports. So if you have a person like myself or Charlie Anderson or Joe Anderson or Charles Washington or these other long-term carnivores, and they are doing well, both clinically and in many cases, based on other objective measurements, then we have to say that is a hypothesis, and so it needs to be tested. So some of that, some of the early testing has been done. There's much more that needs to be done with regard to carnivory. So here's where what I'd like to point out to Chris Kresser. Chris Kresser makes this argument that nutritional epidemiology is kind of not that helpful, that mechanistic data is really not that helpful. But then he goes on to say that fruits and vegetables and fiber are all super important to the diet, and we should not adopt a carnivorous diet. But again, the same data. What supports fruit and vegetables? Again, weak epidemiologic associations, the same ones that he criticized when it came to negating saturated fat as a risk. And then again, mechanistic data that, again, is nice to know, but it doesn't really necessarily support your point. If we want to look at the randomized controlled trials that have been done on, adding fruits and vegetables to the diet, and George Ede does a very nice job of pointing this out, Dr. George Ede at the website diagnosisdiet.com, we have to say that there's only been a handful of actual randomized controlled trials of adding whole fruits and vegetables to the human diet, and by and large, those studies are very uncompelling. They don't support a tremendous benefit to adding fruits and vegetables to the diet. They show in some cases the outcome is negative. And to be honest, the better outcomes that were there were shown with fruit. And Dr. Georgie, again, does a very nice job of pointing this out. And so I would encourage you to look at her information on that stuff. The same thing goes around fiber. Again, a lot of epidemiologic data, a lot of association. There are a number of studies out there supporting that not eating a lot of fiber is actually better for our digestive tract, our digestive health. And so with regard to things like diverticulitis and things like constipation and even things like irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's disease, and ulcerative colitis. And again, those things, if you have irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's disease, or ulcerative colitis, particularly those last two, your risk of colon cancer goes up high. And so, again, we have to put these things in big picture. And so I thought it was a very good forum. Hopefully he'll get more of that on there. Maybe I'll get back on the show. We don't know. I sent a note to Joe saying I applaud him for what he did. I thought it was a good forum to do that. But again, Chris Kresser's arguments I thought were very good. I thought that the realization that epidemiology is at best a hypothesis generator. Most of the epidemiology has very weak associations, so they're almost not even worth looking at, quite honestly. And I hate to say that because there's a lot of work and money that went into that, but it is what it is. And I think Professor John Anitis at Stanford has been very vocal and critical about that, and I think there's a lot more people coming around to that. And so we have to say, we're kind of left with a lot of questions about epidemiology, nutrition in general. I think, we're looking at a 1,000-piece puzzle for which we have about 12 pieces put in place. And I think there's a lot more information we need to know. Hopefully as time goes by, as I try to collect more data, try to do more rigorous science, it's not easy without any money. hopefully that'll change and we can get some funding for looking at carnivorous diets. Some of the work coming out of Hungary, out of the Paleomedicina group with Sabatoth, Sophia Clemens, and others are showing some pretty promising results. So if you guys are interested in some of the published case reports that are out there, that is interesting, and that revolves around gut permeability, which I think is an important topic. Again, we don't understand everything about the microbiome. That's one thing I think. One of the problems with this mechanistic data, yes, feeding certain gut bacteria fiber causes an increase in short-chain fatty acids. That's true. That's a mechanism. What is the long-term result in people? Again, we don't really know that. We also know that if you're on a ketogenic diet, those same enterocytes, the cells that line the intestinal tract, also receive the same benefits from the fatty acids. And so, again, mechanisms, speculation are just that. You can't take too much to the bank with that yet. We have to see what happens in living, actual human beings. Remember, humans are a complicated system. We have to look at systemic results. That's why I'm so big on let's look at long-term metrics, not short-term transient things like certain lab values. And I think Dr. Kahn, to his credit, pointed out the necessity to get things like coronary artery calcium scans, to get things like carotid intermedial thickness studies, and to look at these long-term markers of disease as a true measure of what's going on rather than these really transient, very labile biomarkers. All right, so that's my take, guys. Let me know what you think. Vegans, make sure you point out how old I look and how bad my voice sounds and how I'm going to die any minute and, blah, 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 blah stuff. For the rest of you guys that are, that actually want to, discuss this intelligently, I think this is a discussion that needs to continue to take place. And I hope more people will do that and take this up and look at this seriously. It's exciting. I'm being contacted by doctors that are wanting to do some carnivorous research, and, more power to them. I think I think in the end, and I think this is something that, I'll talk to Joel Kahn about. I mean, in the end, we all want to just help people. We want to do what's right for people. We can disagree about, particular ways about doing that. But I think in the end, everybody wants to, I think most people want to just do what's right for as many people as possible. And that's certainly what I want to do. I certainly don't want to die prematurely. I don't want my family to do. I don't want loved ones to die prematurely. I don't want anybody that takes my advice to get sick or die prematurely. And so, you're doing the best that you can with the information you have in front of you. And I continually see, positive results, and again, if you just scroll through my feed, particularly on my social media, some of the Meat Heal stories, you'll see a lot of people are getting benefit from this. And so I think ultimately that's important. And that's, the N=1 is the most important study you need to worry about. All right, guys, I'm going to go enjoy a couple steaks. Take care now.